a special afternoon version of the show.
So
Who wouldn't want to
unusual.
be here?
So unusual. We have Professor Lawrence Lessig with us today. He's the Roy L. Furman Professor of Law and Leadership at Harvard Law School and the founder of Equal Citizens. He's also a founding board member of Creative Commons because a lot of his work years ago when I first learned about him was in copyright and copyright reform. Now he's gotten into electoral reform. So we'll be talking about both those things today. And he has a very lovely assistant, Valentina, who's watching. So hello, Valentina.
Hey, Valentina. Boy, we have, if I had introduced him, it would have been so terrible because I'd be like, he's like a rock star. Like, how there's like lawyers, but this one's like a rock star lawyer. So it's very different.
True.
It's true though. Backpack Show.
Fred Faulkner IV says, Larry is a rock star. And Chloe said, someone said bonus. I'm here for it.
It's always good to get the gang together. So I don't want to delay. I just want to bring out Larry. I can't call him Larry. It's like Professor Lessig. I'm like translating in my mouth every time, but he's a real guy. It's fair. Hang on. Let's bring him out. Hi.
Hey, how you doing?
Waiting for Chris to say, hello, Professor Larry Lessig.
if I just never say any like addressing words or something that I could be, the stenographer will have to roll back the tape to even say, to whom am I addressing?
No.
It's gonna work out fine.
So as it happens, we are talking to one of the most preeminent copyright lawyers and activists of the day. And Chris, you just had your first experience with a copyright dang on YouTube.
I'll run it by you. An hour ago, I just looked at my YouTube channel, as one might, and I saw a copyright claim. And I just looked at it a few times and I thought, that can't really be real. So almost like you try to scrape it off the screen. So I click it and it says, you in this video you shot about how to use this software, StreamYard, you used a clip of a Netflix trailer for 10 or 11 seconds and somebody's disputing that. I always like that too. Somebody's disputing it. And so I clicked their little dispute buttons, which are all super set up for not me, and said, hey, no, I think this counts as fair use because it's in an educational context. We're not in any way watching the whole trailer. We're watching a really tiny snippet because in my head, I sort of had that 15-second number, which I think I made up.
Which is a myth. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what I have. So I what do you say, Professor? I know this can't constitute actual legal advice, but what do you think?
What I think is the system is insane, right? I mean, what's happened is YouTube has built into their architecture the capacity to scan everything as it's uploaded and match it against a database, which has also been uploaded, to see whether there's any plausible claim. And if the supplier is someone who wants to make every claim, they just flip a button and every time they see it, they turn it off. Now, of course, they shut it off or they make the strike against you, forcing you either to take the stuff down or more likely forcing you to give over all of the money you might be making from your content to this so-called artist, or actually it's a publisher who gets the money. And so it's flipped completely the capacity of people to become creative in the context of this digital platform, exactly contrary to what we thought it would be 10 years ago.
But it's definitely had a chilling effect because now that 11 or 10 seconds, which was only to demonstrate the capability of software, completely unrelated to the content itself, now you're going to be like, oh, I can't do that next time. Even though if you took that case, all the way, you might just win it because it's actually it's not really replacing the need for people to go and watch the whole trailer somewhere else, But nobody can afford that. It's crazy. Nobody can afford to win that suit, even though they should.
Yeah, no, I once faced this when, you might have seen recently when AOC was elected, she was part of one of these remixes of Listomania, which is this really beautiful series. I've seen at least 50 of these that are on the web. And I, when I was doing work around copyright about a decade ago, was giving a lecture in Korea. And in Korea, I showed clips from each of these. And the band filed an action against me, or at least, did one of these triggers on YouTube against me when I had posted up this lecture about copyright and the extremism of the current regime of copyright protection. So when they did that, I was like, make my day. I called EFF and EFF defended me. And so we went and we countersued them. And they promised to change their behavior. They promised to actually look for fair use and be much more careful. But of course, they, might not be taking my stuff down, but there are so many artists out there who can no longer make money in this platform because they're wrongfully attacked for things that should be fair use.
We just spoke with on the show within the last couple of weeks, the Oral Nuts, who are really popular YouTube creators. They make things comedies that weren't comedies before. So they strip out the dialogue and they add original music. What they do is really transformative. And yet they can't monetize the vast majority of their videos. They have to, make money through Patreon. They have to do other things because it's not going to work, even though it really probably should.
Absolutely. And, if we sat down and we thought about what should a copyright regime look like here, we could fix it. Not so that artists would get no money from the remixes. If you think about the way cover albums work, right? A cover album, like the Beatles record an album, anybody has a right to do a cover version of that album within the contours of the law of cover. And if they've not given a price for that, then the law sets the price. So there's a very simple way to enable new artists to demonstrate both their abilities and also to get into a market and be able to become better artists. We could do the same thing with remix, right? There could be a very simple formula. You just run it through the same machines that YouTube is using. It calculates the 57 cents you owe for the video that you've actually produced. You pay the 57 cents, just like you pay for the lighting that goes and helps make your video work. And then you could be creating and actually monetizing from that kind of creativity. And this is the thing that scares me. I mean, the extraordinary potential that's out there has been shut down or channeled into professional tracks, basically because the copyright system is not going to encourage this kind of creativity.
Do you think it's maybe intentionally difficult to navigate? Chloe, who's watching, says it's like an impossible maze.
Yeah, of course it's intentionally difficult. Many people won't even remember this, of course, but at the beginning of the internet, there was something called internet radio. And what internet radio was people basically setting up radio stations where they were streaming content, music content. And there were extraordinary diversity of people, people who would concentrate on 15th century Baroque music or whatever. And they would become very good DJs of content. So of course they were exploiting copyrighted material. And the question was what price should they pay? So Congress went through this process, and there was a rulemaking process and a procedure to determine what the price they should pay is. And then the major labels came in and they proposed these prices. And the lobbyists for Yahoo acknowledged in the middle of the testimony that they were setting the prices for the purpose of wiping out this extraordinary diversity of DJs because they just didn't want them. They didn't want a world of 15,000 people engaged in the process of figuring out how to serve music in a way people are interested in. What they wanted was one or two major players, because if they have one or two major players, it's easier to demand what they want from those players than it is to set up the rules for everybody else. So this strategy of using the law to destroy the opportunity for diverse creativity is longstanding. And of course, it's my own view, what led Aaron Swartz to tell me I had to take up this cause 12 years ago, until we change the corrupting influence of money in politics. It's not just copyright that will never be fixed. It's absolutely everything that matters will never be fixed.
Well, I was going to think I had to do some sort of 90-degree segue to get us to
I'm good at
next
that,
bit of, my gosh, you just brought us there. You just landed the plane where we're going next.
Fixing copyright is not enough.
That's
yeah,
right.
so you have to fix the Electoral College and everything else now. So
Chip raises an important point, which is Congress isn't necessarily the best qualified group of people to adjudicate anything relating to technology.
No.
That's fair.
No, that's fair. And especially because these people are so dependent on their funders. Like members of Congress, candidates for Congress, spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time raising money. And of course, they're raising money from this tiny, tiny fraction of the 1%. So they're extremely dependent and so very responsive to what this tiny fraction of funders would want. And of course, Hollywood has an enormous amount of influence because of their reliable funding of these important members of Congress.
Is this what moves us forward to be even more compromised? Is this why now we're heading into equal citizens territory? Talk a little bit about the transition. And it's not like you could only work on the one thing your whole life. I mean, I guess you could, but you could have lots of, hit concepts that you have to work on. But what brought you to this shore? What brought you to look at this? Is it you couldn't deal with that something, as trivial compared to how big this is, or how did you get there?
No, I was happy to be trivial. That was not a problem for me. What happened? I mean, I've told this story before, but I'm happy to share it again. 12 years ago, a dear friend of mine, a friend who we lost to suicide about 5 years ago, Aaron Swartz, who had been an extraordinary internet activist at an extremely young age. He built the infrastructure for Creative Commons. He was one of the original architects behind Reddit. But he'd become an important activist, progressive activist. And he came to me this is December of 2006. And he said to me, why do you think you're going to make any progress on these questions of copyright or the internet so long as we have this deeply corrupted Congress? And I was a little frustrated with him because he had come and I was showing him, I was just finishing Remix, which is the last book I wrote about copyright. And I was preparing for my first TED Talk, which was going to be about copyright and the crush caused by the law. And I said to him, Aaron, it's not my field. And he said, what do you mean? You field as an academic? I said, yeah, it's not my field as an academic. I do internet and copyright. And he said, what about as a citizen? Is it your field as a citizen? And I realized when he told me that he had trapped me because I wanted to think good of myself. I especially wanted to think good of myself in the light of people who are idealistic and principled like Aaron. And I didn't have a good argument against what he was saying because, I had tenure. I could work on whatever I wanted to work on. And between the life of continuing to tweak the arguments about why Mickey Mouse needed to be free, or dealing with a much more fundamental problem that if we solved would enable us to fix copyright and climate change and healthcare policy and the minimum wage or whatever else you cared about, it was obvious I needed to be working in this other area. So literally that night, I promised him I would end my work in internet and copyright. That summer at the iCommons conference in Dubrovnik, I announced that's what I was going to do. And from then on, this has been the work that I've been doing. Now, I thought naively I could do it in 10 years. I thought every 10 years I would just start a new project. It's 12 years and, we haven't fixed this problem yet. So I don't think the 10-year horizon was realistic, but I'm in it until we get it, or at least another 10 years. And because there's nothing more important, because whatever else you think is important, I can show you how we can't get anything sensible for that thing until we fix this thing.
So maybe then explain the underlying problem for people who've kind of given up on politics, which is most of the people I know.
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of evolved in how I think about it, but here's my current riff. So, we're supposed to have what the conservatives will tell you is a republic, but which the framers meant by that a, quote, representative democracy. So the thing about a representative democracy, it's kind of built into the title. It's supposed to be representative, which means that the representatives are supposed to care equally about all of us. But we've built into our democracy all of these institutions that make the system unrepresentative. So the grossest example is just the way we fund campaigns, right? If you spend 30 to 70% of your time sucking up to 150,000 Americans, there's no doubt those 150,000 Americans have orders of magnitude more power than the average person. They get their calls answered, they get their legislation blocked or introduced. They're the ones who matter to members of Congress. We're not equal compared to them. But not just money in politics. Think about gerrymandering. Districts drawn explicitly for the purpose of rendering some people irrelevant to the political process and making other people more important.
So when you redraw the lines so that so a group of voters loses their impact.
Power, absolutely. Or the Electoral College. Most people think the Electoral College is a problem because it's benefiting so-called small states. That's not the problem with the Electoral College. The problem with the Electoral College is the only states that matter are the so-called swing states. And that's because each state allocates their electors in a winner-take-all fashion, which means the winner of the popular vote gets all of the electoral votes. Well, everybody knows who's going to win California or New York or Kentucky. So those states don't matter to anything that would happen in the presidential election. The states that matter are the swing states. Well, there's only, in 2016, there were 14 of them. I think there are probably 10 of them in this election. So that means the president bends over backwards to make those 10 states happy. Well, those 10 states don't represent America. They're older, they're whiter, their industry is kind of 19th century industry. And so the point is that way of electing the president makes a president who doesn't care about the average citizen. He cares about these kind of weird people from the so-called swing states, or the Senate filibuster, or the way we allow votes to be suppressed. The point is, add up all of these different ways in which we render a representative democracy unrepresentative, and it's not surprising people feel like why should I waste my time caring about the system that does not in any real sense care about me? So many people complain. They say, you don't even vote, or young people don't turn out at the same proportion that older people do. Yeah, because it makes no sense to, because the system is built so that they don't matter. And so until we fix that, there will be a small number of people who have enormous power inside of the system who are going to have the capacity to make it so that the system bends to them, not to what most people care about. And that's going to block every important reform that we know we need to have in order to deal with the problems we can see America has.
So we have a comment. Would more bodies and money accelerate the work? And if so, which foundations would invest? Do you need a crowdsourced fundraiser?
Well, there are a lot of, so there's really two parts. That's a great question. There are two parts to this. And I'm, just lay my cards out on the table here. In my view, we're facing an existential crisis in this next election. If we don't replace the president and send the Dark Lord of Washington, Mitch McConnell, back to Kentucky, I'm not sure what happens over the next, 50 years of America. I mean, I'm really genuinely fearful about how this nation evolves, because we have seen so much destruction of basic norms of representative democracy over the past 4 years already. I mean, 4 years ago, somebody had said, the president of the United States is going to conspire with the postmaster general to destroy the infrastructure of the post office so they can't deliver ballots on time, I would have said that person was nuts. There is no possibility that would ever happen. But here we are in the middle of it.
I would have said maybe that would happen. I would have thought perhaps the president that did that wouldn't admit it.
Yeah, well, that's right. That's a measure. They're not even willing to admit it. So the point is, I think that there's an existential crisis to get past this. But when we get past this, if we do get past this, then I think it's absolutely essential that we push this Congress to adopt the fundamental reform that they've promised that they would adopt, right? If the Democrats take control of the House and the Senate and Joe Biden is the president, there's a shot that in the first 100 days, because Biden has promised and Nancy Pelosi is committed, as has Chuck Schumer, that they would pass fundamental reform of the system, changing the way congressional elections are funded, changing gerrymandering, changing the suppression of the vote, adding ethics protections. And there's a chance that we would begin to have a shot at a representative democracy again.
That passes laws that most people support. It's just most of us are in the middle somewhere. Not a lot of us are on kind of the fringes, but the fringes are what's driving things.
The fringe drive things because the fringe fund campaigns and because the fringe are the most responsive to the actions that politicians need.
Chloe in Scotland says it seems like a lot of people feel that an entire country shouldn't be led by one person anymore. What are your thoughts? Of course, Congress is supposed to be able to do stuff too, right? It's just
that's a great point. I mean, I think Chloe's point is exactly right. The 20th century was the age of the the authority of the single leader, whether good or bad, like FDR or Mussolini, you take your pick. And we have this image of the great leader, JFK or Lyndon Johnson or Reagan, leading us. And what I think the framers of our Constitution realized is that's a really dangerous model for running a representative democracy. So they didn't make the president the first part of our Constitution. The first part of our Constitution, Article 1, is Congress, because they thought Congress would be the most important institution. But we've allowed our Congress to become so corrupted and so dysfunctional because of the way we fund elections, because of the million structural features of Congress, that everybody's given up on Congress. And they've turned to these kind of increasingly authoritarian presidents or to the courts, both of whom are really destructive of democracy in the long run.
Does the empire just crumble eventually? I mean, every empire falls, right? I mean, I'm a pretty nihilistic guy by nature, I guess. And all I think is, that speech in the newsroom, this isn't the most wonderful country in the world. I feel that every day now. And so is there a way that all of those dominoes fall that way for you? Or do you think it all just collapses and we all finally start looking longingly at other systems again?
I'm schizophrenic about that kind of question. So, standing back in a kind of academic sense, do I think you're likely right? Yeah, of course I think you're right. But then as a citizen, I can't begin to accept that frame. I just refuse to accept it. Because, there's lots of things bad about us in our past, especially. But there's something uniquely wonderful about the constant commitment to a more perfect union, which is to admit our problems and to try to get beyond them and make things better. And of course, some problems it's astonishing we're still struggling with. 7% of America shows up to protest George Floyd because, Jesus, really? In the 21st century, we still see this kind of systematic brutality on the basis of race. So it's not like we've been great in a lot of respects, but we have built inside of the DNA of our system the commitment to constant improvement. And I have to believe that's possible. And I will act as if it's
takes work.
Possible.
It takes work. And a lot of people are sort of like, well, I got to just stay alive. And especially right now, in the middle of a pandemic, they're like, I'm just trying to keep body and soul together. I don't have time for like kind of the higher order things. But now is exactly the time you have to pay attention to the higher order things.
Well, at least to figure out one thing. Who should you vote for on November 3rd? It's astonishing to me that's a hard question for some people. And I've actually kind of made it a personal commitment to find ways to talk to people who are still questioning or puzzled about that. I started my life as a conservative, as a young Republican, teenage Republican. I was the youngest member of a delegation in the 1980 convention for Ronald Reagan. So I feel like I grew up in the Kentucky part of Pennsylvania. I feel like I understand the perspective. I don't understand how people from that perspective support this president. So I think that there's like a valuable process of just trying to reach out and connect and not say, look, I want to convince you of single payer healthcare, even though I would love to convince them of single payer healthcare or, student debt relief or climate change. I'm thinking all sorts of substantive issues I really think I would love to try to persuade people about. But it's like, let's put all that aside. Just look at this fundamental question. This man is an authoritarian who does not believe in democracy. How can you support him? This man says he, is supported by evangelicals. How could a Christian support this man? And try to bring them back to what should be a kind of core recognition. So, the things that have been my favorites in this election cycle have been things like Republican voters against Trump, the RVAT series, which, they basically have collected thousands of these videos from ordinary Republicans on their cell phones, sort of saying, look, I voted for Trump and I'm never voting for, I'm not voting for Trump again. And here's why. Those are extremely effective because it does no good to have a kind of, liberal law professor try to lecture to like conservative Republicans. But when a conservative Republican says, yeah, I made a really big mistake. This was a tragic mistake. And here's why, there's a chance they'll be heard. Now, astonishingly, there's still extraordinary resistance to that view among Republicans. It's astonishing the president still has a very high popularity among Republicans, but that's, I think, our only opportunity for hope here.
But we've lost some critical thinking skills. And I'm not sure, honestly, that our educational system was ever set up to encourage critical thinking. It seems like it's set up to drill it actually out of kids. It's like, you don't need to think, you just need to memorize and do what you're told. So we have a lot of work to do if we hope to fix the way people consider things like who should be president and what evidence they use to back up their opinions, if any. We have to start way earlier than like now.
Yeah. And of course, in this sense, the internet's not helping because we know psychologically people are really good at rationalizing their views. And smarter people are better than less smart people. So, with climate change, it's not stupid people who don't believe in climate change. If you're a smart person on the right, you're more likely able to deflect data about climate than if you're not. So the point is, the smarter you are, the better you are at ignoring evidence and confirming the view or the judgment that you start with. And so the point is that in an internet world where we have these different tribes fed by cable television that speaks to its own tribe, by internet platforms that advertise or channel through algorithms to their own tribe, it's very easy to have your views reinforced by everything you see around you. And so the point often when I'm having these conversations with Trump supporters is not that they understand the world that I understand and disagree with it. They often don't even we don't even understand the same facts. We're not even talking about the same story. And I've been surprised examples on the left. For example, there's a big thing about Trump and kids in cages, and these images of the kids in cages. I was recently kind of surprised to learn that those pictures are actually from 2014, not the Trump administration at all. That's true that the Trump administration has adopted an absolute policy that the Obama administration didn't, of removing kids from their parents. But the whole image that was developed on the left of Trump building these cages as part of the project of building walls and putting kids in them is just, not true. Yet those on my side of the debate have had this image drilled into our head, and we're so motivated by the idea that the man is taking children and putting them in the cages that it's hard even to accept the story that it might not actually be like that. Well, it's the same on the other side. And that's because of the platform that we have seen evolve, driven by the overwhelming objective to serve the god of advertising. And as long as that's the reality, I'm not sure how we get out of that.
Apparently it's a problem all over the world. Chloe just wants to point out it's not just in America that critical thinking is kind of taking a backseat. It's everywhere.
Yeah. Although I kind of sometimes think that we're the canary in the coal mine, that the problems that we see or that we're experiencing are just kind of 2 years ahead of the problems that are going to be emerging elsewhere if they don't avoid our mistakes.
There's a book I read a while back called American Spartan, and it was by an author named Ann Scott Tyson. And I'm trying to remember. The guy's name was, he was a special forces guy, Major Jim Gant. I had the chance to talk to him when the book first came out, as one does. And the U.S. put a pretty big hit piece on the guy because he was trying to expose the detail that the government was thrilled with what he did until it didn't serve them, and then they decided they needed to knock him out of the ability to communicate game by kind of poking some holes in him. Like, he had, near the end, he was having a drinking problem. He'd had an extramarital affair, and they throw all this on to kind of discredit him after he'd done what he'd done. None of this matters to the story except to give you the back painting on him. But what he said was understanding Afghanistan was to understand that the real challenge wasn't Sunni versus Shia. It wasn't, the U.S. interest versus other interests. The insurgency wasn't the issue. It turned out it was rural people versus urban people. And that was the real byline on where the fight is, the real dividing line, I should say, on where the fight is in Afghanistan. In a lot of ways, I've been really attentive to this sort of eat the rich class storyline that's going on in this world. And that, whenever I get a pizza delivery or something, my pizza guy is 100% every single time Trump, and has an incredible narrative that I've never heard from anyone I speak to in my day. And I guess what I'm saying is it's interesting. Massachusetts clearly still in the bubble of smart places where, we think too big of ourselves. Is there some of that? Is rural versus urban? Is, poverty versus not so? Is that the war? And is that why people are having trouble understanding?
I think that there's a version of that drives the current misunderstanding. And it's a lot about kind of status of different identities. And so if you look at somebody like me, a white male, over 50, and you think white males over 50, when I was growing up, every single hero was a white male. Like, that was the world. And, and so I imagine the people I grew up with, or the people, who are out of a job in Ohio and have no retirement, who look at the world of today and recognize that most of the heroes have nothing to do with being white males. They're women, or they're African Americans, or people of color. And of course, from my perspective, that's a wonderful thing. But from their perspective, it's almost like, where did my world go? Like, something that was given to me that was very important to me, I now discover has been taken away from me. And I'm very angry about that. And so this is the latent frustration that I think Trump is so good at tapping into, because the reality is those people are suffering not because of people of color or women. They're suffering because the economy, the economic system, has totally shifted away from giving them any support at all. So they have economically no hope, and they need an excuse. And their excuse is, all these people who were not the important people when they were growing up. That's a really hard problem to solve with anything other than just economic opportunity. Like, we just have to give people, again, a chance to make it. Like, give the middle class an opportunity to succeed. And everybody's climbing. Everybody doesn't have to be rich. They just have to feel like next year is going to be better than this year. My kids are going to be at least as well off as I am, or better. That idea, which of course, when I was a kid, was taken for granted. You could go to a public high school in the middle of Pennsylvania, and you could still desire to go to a great university, or to go be a success in business or whatever. Today, that's just not true. The whole Horatio Alger myth in America is a myth. And it's not a myth in other parts of the world, like Sweden or the Scandinavian countries. The Horatio Alger myth is actually true. But this is because of economic policy we've enacted that makes it so hard for people in the middle class to succeed anymore. And I think what they do is they look for an excuse, and this really poisonous identity-based excuse becomes the tool. And the president has tried to leverage that. Now, I think it's not working for him anymore. I hope.
Oh boy,
Kip wants you to run.
Well, Lawrence Lessig, the last part of our show always is we have the reason it's called the Backpack Show is that we're all kind of operating without a foundation anymore. We're building on sand. And so we can really only hope to carry around with us what we can carry in a backpack. And so people add metaphorical things to it. They add hope, or they add humility, or they add just some essence that they need to succeed in the next 5 years. So,
or they cheat and try to add another backpack.
Or they try to add a second backpack in there. So here's the question: what goes in your backpack?
So my kids sometimes write me little notes. So there's a collection of those that's in my backpack. Because at some point at a certain stage in life, you realize if you're fortunate enough to have kids, this is all there really is. That's all it's about. And then there's a Kindle with 1 billion books that I've always wanted the chance to read. And so that's basically, I think those are the two things. I don't know what else I need in my backpack.
So when everything is fixed, you'll go back and read all the stuff in your Kindle.
Sure.
What do you know? When we're all set.
Yeah. Well, Lawrence Lessig, thank you so much. Everyone, you can check it out at equalcitizens.us. You could just at Lessig on the tweeters. So glad to have you here. Remember that this show is always sponsored by our kind friends at StreamYard that I totally forgot to mention in this episode, but
we were occupied. But everything you've seen through the whole show is pure StreamYard, us displaying everybody's comments, all that, the participation.
Makes you 21% more handsome.
Len Joy, great author, previous guest.
Len Joy showed up. Hi, Len. Good to see you.
He should be our person of the day, but now we can't have two, can we?
Because we have Kip Meacham, who came and commented his face off. So we have to. He has to stay person of the day.
Try again tomorrow, Len.
We will. So listen, my mom always wanted me to end this show a little more better. So here it is.